Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, I have a list of queries from an important, prestigious Iranian journal, and it's a list of 12 questions, but a lot of the questions overlap, and so I'm going to be addressing the questions, but without repetition. So the first question states Islamic thought was the basis for new thought and was considered the junction of different cultures during early centuries. However, intellectual stagnation has been notable, especially in Iran during recent decades. It seems that the ossification of thought and no renaissance in epistemology have been the main problems in Islamic society in recent centuries. A lack of critical thinking and dominance of ideological dogmatism has probably intensified this ossification of thought. What do you think? How do you evaluate the situation? Well, obviously, many of the questions, in fact, have to do with intellectual stagnation. What here is referred to as the ossification of thought, the failure to produce critical thinking that matches the demands of our age. Let me preface what I'm going to say by noting that many of the issues raised in these questions I've wrestled with in my book, Reasoning with God. So, in fact, I do address a lot of these issues in the book now that has been over 10 years, published about 10 years ago, Reasoning with God. The use of reason in light of the divine and in conjunction with a divine mandate. Moreover, in the past 2 years, I have undertaken a project of reinterpreting the entire Quran. And alhamdulillah, I just completed that, completed the process of reinterpreting that entire Quran from a distinctively historical and moral perspective. And so it is. The reason I note this is that part of our problem as Muslims is not just the lack of production of thought, but the fact that we do not have institutions that nurture Islamic thinking so that we can build upon one another. Often, if there's any production of thought, we exist as little isolated islands in which someone will write or lecture, and there is very little cross engagement among Muslim intellectuals. Very little process of the way that thought develops is that you engage thought. We listen to each other. We critique one another, but we don't critique to destroy, but we critique to build. So we critique in order to encourage the producer of thought to, in fact, further develop their thinking to higher heights of sophistication. But that is lacking in the Muslim world. In the institutions that engage and nurture thinking have been absolutely destroyed. The problem of ossification of thought and the death of critical thinking, I mean, we need to be very realistic about this. how does critical thought emerge? Well, critical thought, like all forms of talent, like all forms of scientific discovery, like all forms of artistic discovery, needs institutions that support education, support thinking, that invest in education so that you provide students, so that you can create a system that acts as a radar for talented students, and then provides talented students with opportunities for growth and engagement. So you need infrastructures that invest in education, and you need this golden elixir, this magical elixir, freedom. Because if they are afraid of ostracism and afraid of making mistakes, if the minute they venture beyond what the accepted norms, they are shamed and berated and attacked, then they abandon the project of thinking. And the only way you can actually nurture thinking is by giving people the freedom to be right, not 90% of the time, but it's good enough if they are right 50% of the time. People have to have the freedom to make mistakes in order to get things right. And there has to be institutions that engage people with talent. So, for instance, why is it that you find in Western societies that there are famous violinists and famous pianists and famous composers? It is not because elsewhere in the world there are no prodigies. Prodigies are born in every society. The difference is if you are born in the US, if you are born in England, if you're born in France, if you are born in Italy, and you are a musical prodigy, there are opportunities for growth. There are institutions that have investments that in turn invest in talented prodigies so that these prodigies can grow. And that's the way you nurture talent. If a prodigy is born, as happens in all Muslim countries, I'm sure there are a million Mozarts that were born in Muslim countries, a million Beethovens, but there are no institutions that nurture them, and so they die. But the problem of freedom is a very serious issue, because what Muslim country has had institutions in which thought, this is not an issue of crisis in religious thought, this is crisis in all thought. All Muslim countries have governments that want to engineer thinking to service power, to service whatever dictatorial system of government is in power. You find this in Egypt. The Egyptian government looks at all intellectual thinking as having one purpose, and that's to enable the dictatorial system in government to stay in power. Same thing with Saudi Arabia, same thing with the Emirates, same thing with Iran, same thing with Tunisia, same thing with Morocco, same thing with Algeria. The entire the political system is so suffocating, is so dominating, is so hegemonic that it looks at institutions of humanities, and in fact looks at the entire educational system as really having one use. Are you going to help me stay in power? if you're not going to help me in stay of power, then I have no use for your thinking. And as a result, there's, look in terms of percentage, how much of the American GNP, the gross national product, is invested in education. How much of the budget in France is invested in education. How much in Britain is invested in education. Look at philanthropy. How much of the money of philanthropy goes to educational institutions, and compare that to Muslim countries. Muslim countries do not invest in education. The part of the GNP that is directed to education is very little, and there is no seriousness about educational system because of the authoritarian governments in power that find liberty in thinking, freedom in thinking, dangerous. They find the world of ideas dangerous. And as long as you have governments in power that find thinking dangerous, ideas to be dangerous, you have a phenomena where any serious thought that emerges will be the rare exception, not the rule. Because it basically, you have to fight society, you have to fight the government, you have to fight everything to be a critical, serious thinker. So for instance, I mean, we could go on many examples. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, one of the most interesting thinkers was someone called Hassan Farhat al-Maliki. And Hassan Farhat al-Maliki, because he taught free thinking, he's an Islamist, but a critical thinker. Not only did he find that the state is constantly putting him on the defensive, constantly accusing him. But right now, he's in prison and has been in prison now for years. The problem was Muslim societies. I believe that it is too simplistic to lay the responsibility at the doors of the Islamic tradition, because since colonialism, what investments have Muslims dedicated to the institutions of education, and what space for free thinking? It's not that, for instance, it's not that Iran has a crisis of Islamic thought, but the secular Muslim countries are doing better. It's not that Iran has a crisis of thought, but Egypt under Sisi is doing better, or Morocco is doing better, or Tunisia is doing better. Those secular states, because they're dictatorial, also have a complete stagnation of thought, a complete stagnation of secular thought, a complete stagnation of leftist thought, a complete stagnation of all thought because of the institutions of dictatorship. When the entire society, the only real institution in society is the institution of executive power. The judiciary serves the executive power. The legislature serves the executive power. The system of education serves even public health serves the executive power. Everything in society is organized to simply serve the top of the pyramid, that executive power. And the executive power, on top of everything, is corrupt, is extremely corrupt, because it has an absolute monopoly over power and can do as it wills, and doesn't feel that it has to answer to the people. It doesn't really feel it has to answer to anyone other than their elite. And they monopolize the resources of the country. It is what happens, whether that power is secular or that power is Islamic or that power is communist or that power is whatever, it completely creates scorched territory, arid territory. It destroys the land of thinking completely. Because that executive power finds philosophy threatening, finds humanities threatening, finds literature threatening, finds law threatening, finds even anthropology, the life of people threatening, finds art threatening, finds music threatening. And because it finds all of that threatening, it constantly tries to flatten everything so it doesn't pose a threat to its power. And what you end up with is what we have now. The Muslim experience in the modern age has been so dominated by the colonial legacy. And what I mean by that is that either the governments in power are pro their former colonizers, like countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, who cannot exist without the active support and aid of their former colonizers, or by being against their former colonizers, perhaps like Iran. But in either case, you are there are no real native institutions that express anything endemic and authentic to the culture itself, or endemic and authentic to even Islam itself. Islam either becomes a dogma to support whatever the West wants, whatever capitalism wants, or a dogma to oppose whatever the West is or is perceived to be, or to oppose the perceived Western interests. But this is all done very artificially because of dictatorship. Because the executive power in all Muslim countries, and you know why, and let's be honest about this. I mean, there is a very fascinating book called How the West Stole Democracy from the Arab World. Let me see if... Yeah, How the West Stole Democracy from Arabs by Elizabeth Thompson. And the book makes a point that has been made by a number of historians and a number of scholars, that the modern Muslim experience in modernity has become there is constant pressure by it's part race, part class, part religion, but by the power that has been the dominating power since modernity, and that's the Western countries, more specifically Western European countries and the U.S. And the fact of the matter is that the only countries that have managed to succeed in achieving a democratic order have been countries that the West have permitted to have a democracy. So all the former Soviet republics, countries like Poland or countries like Romania, the countries that hardly do not have a democratic tradition, but they were able to maintain or able to create at least a serious democratic project, whether it completely succeeded or not, because of the direct aid and tolerance of their Western brethren. And there's a racial element. You notice that most democracies in the world are white, belong to the white race. There are exceptions like India, but even India is not really an exception. Because of an anti-Islamic element, the West has seen Hindu nationalism and Hindu democracy as non-threatening. And therefore, the West has not exerted the type of pressures on India that they have exerted on, as documented by this book, for instance, on the Arab world and Persia and Iran. I've often wondered what chances did Iran really have after the revolution, when from the very beginning it is no secret that the West pushes a dictatorial regime, the regime of Saddam Hussein, to launch an insane war, a war that must have had a radicalizing impact upon Iran. And then after this war, for there to be constant, non-ending threat of military actions, threat of invasion, severe economic sanctions. Now, all of that served to strengthen the dictatorship in Iran. And by strengthening the dictatorship in Iran, it also forced Iran to constantly spend its resources towards military projects. Not serious education, not serious educational systems, not serious thought, So, we can't just pretend that we live in a world that gives Muslims a fair chance. The fact of the matter is, it has now become very clear after the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan, after the explosion of Islamophobia, after the racism and the Islamophobia that we see in the West, after the role of Israel in the Middle East, that the West has never ceased to be an ideological opponent. That for all their talk about international principles and human rights and democracy, the West has never ceased to see Islam as a threat and a danger and a serious opponent. And for the sake of Israel, it is no accident that Israel is so-called the only democracy in the Middle East, because it is the only country in the Middle East that has consistently received support so that they can create a democracy. Every time any other country in the Muslim world, or especially in the Middle East region, has attempted or tried to create anything resembling a democracy, the West has played a very active role in aborting such efforts and in supporting, if you remember the coup in Algeria when the Islamic Salvation Front won local elections. You remember, of course, what happened after the Arab Spring is obvious. Israel's constant role in partnering itself with dictatorships in the region. So what I am saying is that there is a very serious element to this stagnation of lack of investments in education. But the reason for the failure to invest in education, because for thought to grow, there needs to be space and there needs to be support. The persistence of dictatorial regimes that consider thinking, critical thinking, consider analytical thinking, consider original thinking, consider innovative thinking to be a threat. and the persistent role of the West that has, despite of all the jargon about human rights and democracy and so on, has always deemed it in its own best interest that Muslims do not experience democracy, do not have any type of regime that respects human rights, and have consistently supported uh, uh, the colonial paradigm, or never really rid itself of its colonizing mentality towards the Muslim world. That this world exists to be dominated, controlled, and engineered and regulated, and that you cannot allow Muslims freedom to grow because Muslims are dangerous. And because they're dangerous, we always have to make sure that they are consistently under control and under watch and under our gaze, and the West doesn't make it is not doesn't make it a secret that they see is their support of Israel as all the bloating, all the bragging right now about Israel and the Emirat, Israel and Saudi, Israel and Bahrain, is they say, see, the role that we saw for Israel in the region as a power that ensures that this region remains a servant to Western interests. Our vision has borne fruit. Look, it's actually what we've planned for so long, in fact, has worked. It doesn't matter how fanatic or how crazy or how extremist or the Israeli government is. What matters is that they make sure that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, the Emirat continue to serve Western interests, American interests, British interests, French interests. So this is a very serious part of the picture. And I think, it's very too easy for us to put our heads in the sand and pretend. Now, there has traditional elements, let's say, like Salafi movement or the traditionists are they part of the intellectual stagnation? Well, yes, of course they are, because thought cannot grow if thought is not historicized. If you live in an epistemology of an age that doesn't belong to your own age, if your epistemology really belongs to centuries in the past, if you read tradition not to inspire, to unleash your modern thinking, but basically you read it like an instruction book on how to deal with the challenges of modernity, of course that has a stagnating impact. But in my view, if there were a true democratic environment, the Salafis and traditionists would have been naturally vanquished in the battleground of thought. I remember that in the very short democratic experience Egypt had after the Arab Spring, when Mubarak's regime was overthrown, I watched very carefully the way that an organization like the Ikhwan was being challenged by civic society. And the process of the Ikhwan or the Jama'at Islamiyya or whatever other Islamic group, the way that they were forced to defend their ideas and forced to challenge their ideas and forced to think beyond their comfortable dogma was extremely healthy. And if it would have continued, it would, in my view, it would have led to a natural dynamic where there would have been native alternatives to the dogma of Salafism and the dogma of Ikhwanism or the dogma of whatever, because people would have searched for the type of Islamic thinking that makes sense to them, that is comfortable to them, that is consistent with the challenges of the age, but what constantly corrupts this dynamic is authoritarianism. When the person with the weapons, with the arms, with the military comes in and says, that's it, I'm putting a party of you in prison and I'm silencing all serious discussions, and I'm going to tell you basically the conclusions I want you to reach. That is why, Egypt and Saudi Arabia are constantly talking about Tajdid al-Khitab al-Din, renewing Islamic thought. Since the military came to power in Egypt, all Sisi has been talking about again and again and again all the time, renewing Islamic thought. What results is it going to yield? Zero. Why? Because how can a dictator renew thought? A dictator is only interested in thought that serves their power. And so, all the clowns that they have on television 24/7, all the professors that kiss up to Sisi and flatter his government and keep giving these long speeches about renewing Islamic thought, what actual impact will they have on renaissance or intellectual stagnation? Zero. In fact, they will have a negative impact. They will have further stagnation and further death of thought, because people are not, thinking is like a muscle. Society that gets accustomed to civic discourses, public discourses, it's a practice, a training. If society doesn't receive actual practice in the art of civic discourses, the art of exchanging ideas, society doesn't know how to do it. And dictatorship can't teach society the art. We have no serious way to judge the potential of an Islamic renaissance, because dictatorship has always aborted anything but a zero-sum game in which you either have to be dogmatic in your support of dictatorship, or you have to be dogmatic in opposing whatever the school of thought dictatorship represents. And this constant dynamic where the winner takes all, where the people in power get to enjoy all the power and get to vanquish their enemies and wipe out their enemies, will never produce thought. So you can't expect Iran yes, there might be a few exceptions here or there. You might have a Soroush, you might have this, but these are they're the exceptions, because I've dealt with a lot of students from Iran that contact me because they want to study in the US. And what I've noticed about the students from Iran whether they come, the few, even the Iranians that are very hostile to the government in Iran. I'm talking about students from Iran who's received an education of Iran, whether they are pro-government or anti-government, is that they really do not know how to do historical analysis. They really do not know how to write an analytical paper or write analytical research. They really do not know how to do academic research. It is not something that they received any serious training in. And although they might have very impressive degrees from Iran, but it's clear that the educational institutions in Iran are extremely poorly funded. It is clear that they are grossly outdated. It is clear that they have not learned the art of thinking. The muscle of thinking hasn't grown and become strong. And so ultimately, they are at a huge disadvantage. When they arrive, it's like you have to, for them to bear any real potential, you have to retrain them from scratch. I had a student many years ago from Iran. The first time we met, he was doing a doctorate under my supervision. He saw no potential in the Islamic tradition. He thought that the Islamic tradition could not produce anything worth anything. And I told him, okay, well, first, let's see if you really know the Islamic tradition. And I started training him to read. Eventually, he found the thought of an Imam al-Na'ini, Ayatollah al-Na'ini in Iran, and started engaging the thought of al-Na'ini as well as the intellectual teachers of al-Na'ini, and eventually wrote a book, published a book, based on his doctoral research, that really made serious contributions to comparative constitutionalism, to constitutional thinking. And it was the environment of freedom, the environment of serious intellectual engagement, the environment of serious intellectual training that ultimately enabled him to make a serious academic contribution that got a lot of attention from legal comparativists in purely secular institutions on its own right. As long as the Islamic tradition, there are all types of people in the light of dictatorship that appoint themselves the guardians of the Islamic tradition. The problem is the Islamic tradition is massive, and the Islamic tradition is like a giant. The guardians of these traditions are this small. They are dwarfs. The guardians, though, create gateways that are so narrow that they hardly even allow light to come in or out. And as long as dictatorship protects these guardians, imposes these guardians, then you cannot really engage the Islamic tradition. You really are denied access to the Islamic tradition. In over 30 years that I have been working with the Islamic tradition, I fully realize that my scholarship is practically incomprehensible to things like the Azhar University in Egypt. That if you go to Azhari sheikhs and they read what I write, they can't even understand the significance of what I'm saying about Sharia. But this is an institution that have been nurtured by authoritarianism, that has grown under the light of the Nasser regime, the Sadat regime, the Mubarak regime, now the Sisi regime. They do not even understand the world of thought. They have no means of understanding the world of thought. Their students are not accustomed to reading and engaging the epistemology of their age. How can you expect from them anything coming close to a renaissance or a serious engagement of anything, or even look at the critique of the West that comes from the left that comes from Western educational institutions? Compare it to the critique of the West that comes from poorly supported academic institutions in Africa, in South America, in the Muslim world. The difference is that person is coming from the Sorbonne or coming from some American school, coming from New York University, coming from University of California, seriously academic institutions that have serious resources for serious scholarship. And although they produce a scholar that critiques their own culture, a critique of the West, but because that critic grew up in a healthy intellectual educational system, the sophistication of that critic is far greater than a critic that has gone through our extremely modest educational systems. I really see no way forward other than democracy. I see no way forward unless you challenge authoritarianism, you challenge the institutions of despotism. And we cannot imagine a way forward by putting Islamists in prison or putting communists in prison. Part of my work is to show that the way that the Prophet ﷺ built the liberating experience in Medina was by tolerating, not just tolerating, but by allowing for dissent. In fact, the way that the prophetic example tolerated dissent really challenges the limits of tolerance, in the sense that it's hard to imagine any modern political institution displaying the same amount of tolerance. I mean, the Quran consistently talks about the hypocrites, al-munafiqun, who are constantly mocking the Prophet and mocking those who pray and mocking the adhan and opposing some, and yet they're not banished, they're not exiled, they're not imprisoned, they're not killed. But that air of freedom is precisely what created the Islamic civilization. The Islamic, when Muslims found and translated the Greek tradition, it is not because they were translating what confirmed what's in the Quran, but they have developed an appreciation to the value of knowledge itself. We have to accept that a democratic system means there are rights for those who are religiously motivated and those who are not religiously motivated. That the rules of the game are same for those who have a faith and those who don't have a faith. That ultimately we exist under a set of constitutional principles that respects the basic dignity of all, the basic rights of all. And beyond that, beyond these parameters, we must allow people to go through the experience of trial and error in engaging one another so that thought can grow. So that, as God says in the Quran, it is to يميز الخبيث or يميز الخبيث من الطيب, so that the process of natural conflict and engagement, civic conflict, civic engagement, will distinguish what is khabith and what is tayyib, what is vile and what is good. And it is the constitutional principles that set the parameters, the outer parameters. But we have to understand that the less space for civic engagement, the greater the danger for dictatorship. So the more space you allow for civic engagement, the more you are creating buffers against dictatorship. And that is simply a critical thing. Now, the question, there's an important question. According to what Islamic sources or religious education can we consider critical thinking and its basics as a motivation for refreshing the mind of Muslim intellectuals? Is there no Islamic manifestation of critical thinking? Listen, what the word faqih or the word ayatullah or whatever the context that we are, what created a faqih in the past was not just someone that knew the Quran and Sunnah, or the Quran and Hadith. A real faqih, the faqih that left a real influence upon our tradition, was someone who was deeply embedded in the sciences of the age and the epistemology of the age. So in my view, a real faqih in our age is not just someone who has been trained in the Quran and the Hadith, but someone who has been, if I had my way in creating Islamic seminaries, someone who receives rigorous training in philosophy, rigorous training in sociology, rigorous training in history and historical methodology. And you are not going to be able to get quote-unquote religious scholars who can match the demands of the age unless they understand the age that they live in. And they're not going to understand the age that they live in by reading these medieval books. The medieval books are necessary, but they must read the medieval books within the eye of modern historical methodology. So they must receive training in historical methodology. They must receive training in modern philosophical thinking. They must receive training in modern comparative law, because even the legal sciences have greatly advanced. Our understanding of law and the function of law and of legal systems and of comparative legal systems and of the dynamics of processes of law has greatly advanced. It's not, and so if you are talking about training a true scholar of the age, again, you need to invest in educational institutions, and educational institutions that expose that scholar to what the modern world of philosophy is talking about, what the modern world of law is talking about, to how sociology impacts law and impacts social thought, and critically historical methodology, and the difference between chronicles of the past and the way that we try to understand history, and the way that history has an impact on our social institutions and our system and our institutions of knowledge. Now, of course, if you talk about a Wahhabi, a Salafi, they are a far cry from that. Because for the most part, these are people that are technocrats. They simply think that God's will can be accessed mathematically. You know, you read a hadith and that tells you what God wants. While they're anchored in an epistemology, but it's an epistemology that is entirely irrelevant to our age. And when we know from so many serious modern critiques that the modern liberal system is in serious moral trouble, it has produced gravely immoral situations in the world. I mean, our modern system is destroying the environment, is threatening human extinction, has created gross inequities in wealth, has created deeply seated systems of racism and ethnocentrism, has created gross systems of religious intolerance. So there is a lot that the world can benefit from an Islamically nuanced, Islamically anchored voice. But it cannot be the voice of hegemony and the voice of authoritarianism. And it cannot be the voice of dogma, because dogma will not engage anyone or convince anyone. It has to be the voice of the type of faqih that created the Islamic civilization. A faqih who knows what the Quran says, knows what the Hadith says, but is deeply anchored in modern epistemologies and modern systems of knowledge, and has received, I'm often very impressed by the fact that I will find the Catholic Church has sent such and such priest to receive his second doctorate in comparative law from an American educational institution, from the school I teach, for instance, UCLA. I often encounter rabbis who after finishing rabbinic school, went and got a doctorate in sociology, or a doctorate in legal philosophy, or a doctorate in anthropology. And when you talk to them, it's natural for them to say, if I can't make sense, if I can't talk in a way that is convincing to the modern mind, my own people will make me irrelevant. I will become marginal to the lives of Jews or the lives of Christians. You don't see that in the Islamic world. You don't see that in the Muslim world. Because systems of authoritarianism are accustomed to tell you, well, this person is relevant. It doesn't matter how stupid or how ignorant or how illiterate they are. You have to listen to them because that's God's will. Well, it doesn't work that way. That's exactly how intellectual stagnation or intellectual ossification takes hold. We have to restore the ethic that started the Quran with the word Iqra. The passion for knowledge and the conviction that the Quran keeps repeating over and over. Whoever wishes to believe, have them believe. Whoever doesn't wish, ma'ala rasul il balagh, that only, the Prophet just has to convey the message. But so in other words, we must accept that we try to convince people, but if they're ultimately not convinced, then it's their choice. But you see, the challenge of that, people have to become convinced on your own merits, the merits of your thinking, is precisely what acts as a seed for the growth of serious intellectual thought. In many ways, it's like the marketplace of ideas. If you have a monopoly, or artificial monopoly, then you learn to become lazy. You don't have to produce a good product because you know that people have no choice. People are forced to accept the product. But if there's competition, then you are forced to produce a good product. And the competition is that I know that I am challenged by secularists, I'm challenged by atheists, I'm challenged by whatever, every other trend, and that I must make Islamic thinking compelling and convincing. And the only way to do that is through the epistemologies and the tools of knowledge for our age. Of course, no, the question here, do you think Muslims' ossification of thought can destroy the world? No, it will not destroy the world. Because, unfortunately, Muslims are entirely irrelevant to most of the world. I mean, sadly, Muslims are not that important. We are a very large number, but in terms of, the Muslims are under the thumb of the West, so much so. I mean, they control Saudi, they control the Emirat, they control most of the serious Muslim governments of Muslim countries in the world. So the ossification of Islamic thought, it just means the continuation of dictatorship, the continuation of Muslim suffering, the continuation of Muslim irrelevance, the continuation of Muslim marginal. Look at the influence of, India is plagued by political Hinduism, by Hindu chauvinism, Hindu racism, by Hindu nationalism. But the impact of India on the world economy today and on the world political map is enormous. And it's enormous because India has created a democracy for Hindus. And that democracy, that is really a democracy for Hindus, like Israel created a democracy for Jews, it has allowed India to grow in so many spheres and areas as to become an undeniable power. The question here about, interdisciplinary studies. I mean, we've already addressed most of that. I mean, part of specifically Iran's predicament is that so many forces in the world wanted to see the Islamic revolution fail. From, unfortunately, Saudi Arabia to Egypt to the Emirat to Israel to the entire Europe to the United States. The idea that the Islamic Revolution was, because I remember the Islamic Revolution. I was living in Kuwait when it happened, and I remember the terror of the Arab monarchies that the Islamic Revolution would become infectious, and that the same way that the Iranian people overthrew the Shah, that populations in these countries would now overthrow their own dictators. And as a result, I mean, the Iran has been really under a most suffocating stranglehold, and Iran has not been allowed any breathing space. But unfortunately, also, there was a lot of lack of wisdom in that the Iranian government needed the love of its people and needed to win over its people and needed to encourage innovation and creativity and thinking, so that to be able to meet the challenge of so much hostility. Dictatorship has had a very has had very much the opposite effect upon Iran. That it had alienated the people. It effectively handed over a victory to the enemies of the revolution by alienating the state from its people. And that's what happens with a dictatorship. And unfortunately, that's a dictatorship always fears knowledge. And because it fears knowledge, it will never support serious intellectual endeavors, whether interdisciplinary studies or humanities or social sciences, or it's because it always fears what it can't control. You know, the biggest challenge for the Muslim world is the challenge of decolonization. But what I mean by decolonization is that part of the colonial legacy in the Muslim world was have to create the myth of Islamic exceptionalism, the myth of Oriental despotism, that democracy, freedom, human dignity, human rights are good for everyone except for Muslims. That's part of the colonial legacy. Part of what colonialism has consistently taught about the Orient generally, but Muslims most specifically, is that, everyone in the world might want human rights, everyone in the world might want human dignity, everyone in the world might want human freedom, but Muslims don't. It's not good for Muslims. And part of the challenge in decolonization is to reject that logic of Muslim exceptionalism, and to reclaim. I mean, most of my work in reasoning with God and in the tafsir of the Quran that I've done 2 years of the entire retafsir of the Quran is to demonstrate that, in fact, these ethics of despotism, these ethics of taghut, of Taghut, that it's darkness. The very nature of Jahiliyyah is a system in which people are not given the rights, and that the rights of people trump the rights of God, and that is core to our system of thinking. And that it doesn't matter if you have a system that honors all the rights of God but violates the rights of people. And that Orientalism has presented a very dogmatic view of Islamic history and Islamic politics. And unfortunately, the Salafis and Wahhabis are the best allies of Orientalism, because they completely reproduce all the Orientalist tropes, all the Orientalist dogmas. But when you truly read the Islamic tradition from a historically informed perspective, when you are trained in historical methodology, when you are trained in analytical thinking, and you are trained in philosophy, you discover that the Islamic tradition is far richer than its Christian counterpart. You discover that the Islamic tradition is far richer than its Jewish counterpart. I mean, do you know how many books exist about Maimonides? The Jews have taken the one thinker, Maimonides, and he's a superstar. In the West, he's a superstar. In academia, he's a superstar. You know, Cambridge and Oxford and Harvard Press continue to publish books about Maimonides all the time. Look at how many Maimonides exist in the Islamic tradition. The Islamic tradition dwarfs the Jewish tradition. But yet, it has become an element of faith that thinkers like Thomas Aquinas or Maimonides support a system of thought of liberty and rights within Judaism and Christianity. But you come to Islam, and the colonial legacy has convinced the Muslim mind that you don't have a Maimonides, you don't have a Thomas Aquinas. Well, I'm here to tell you that we have 1 million Maimonides and we have 1 million Thomas Aquinas. But in order for that to happen, we have to challenge the myth of Islamic exceptionalism. And the way, think of what your colonial enemies, are they happy when they see a democracy in Egypt, or are they depressed? Why is it that they always want to support dictatorial regimes all over the Muslim world? When you see your enemies, what your enemies want for you or do not want for you, isn't that a very strong indication of what's right or wrong? I mean, if the very fact that Israel will do anything to avoid a democratic system in any Muslim country, the very fact that your former colonizers, England and France and the US, absolutely detest the idea of a democracy surviving in anywhere in the Muslim world, isn't that an indication of how they understand that despotism is the death of the Muslim soul? And they understand that as long as Muslims have dictatorial systems in power, then there is no threat coming from Islam. Then Islamophobia can continue to spread its poison. Israel can continue bragging about how they're the only democracy in the Middle East. We can continue dominating Muslims. I believe that everyone who hates Muslims, the thing they fear the most is that Muslims would discover democracy and discover human rights and would discover dignity. And that instead of throwing Islamists in prison or secularists in prison or whoever is in prison, we learn how to talk to one another. Because then you will find that we will invest in education because we don't fear education, we don't fear ideas, and you will find that the minute you start investing in nurturing talented intellects, what you describe as the ossification of Muslim thought will come to a natural end. Muslims will start writing and thinking and will start celebrating thought and ideas and creativity. I mean, it is demoralizing to write a book like Reasoning with God. You know, so many Christian and Jewish scholars have said, you know, if this book was written by a Jewish scholar or a Christian scholar for their own traditions, it would have received, you know, symposia and conferences, and there have been long discussions, and there have been supporters and opponents, but because it's in the Muslim world, like most Muslim intellectual products, complete silence, complete silence. And that's why you get stagnation, because most people say, you know, what's the point of thinking creatively and innovatively in the Islamic tradition? It just gets you into trouble and gets you, earns you the ire of Muslim institutions of power. What's the point? Okay, I'm gonna stop here to pray, and if I have any other ideas after prayer, inshallah, maybe I'll record them. If not, then we can stop here. Um, Sorry, I had to stop to pray, and I think I've touched upon most everything. But let me just say that. Um, think of the problem as a matter of opportunity. Don't talk. You cannot come and say there's intellectual stagnation if there is no opportunity for intellectuals. Think of how many you have to invest in brains. How many investments in the intellects of people before you produce one Habermas? Or how many investments in intellects before you produce one Umberto Eco? Or how many investments before you produce a single John Rawls, who wrote The Theory of Justice, a very influential work? You have to have a system where you accept that you are going to invest in intellects, and there are going to be many failures before you get a single success, but that success can change the face of humanity. And furthermore, you cannot talk about intellectual stagnation if I, as an intellectual, first I must find that as an intellectual there's opportunity for support and a dignified life. That I can think, I can write, and I can live a dignified life for me and my family. If I think and write and I can't guarantee a dignified life, there will be no thought. But second is that I have to feel safe. If I think and write and all the time I am worried, am I going to say the wrong thing that gets me into trouble and that lands me in prison, or where I get fired from the job? Of course there will be stagnation. Of course there will be no thought at all. Of course. So don't be surprised that there is a stagnation of thought in Iran. Because it's not just Iran. There's a stagnation of thought in Iran, in Egypt, in every Muslim country that is a dictatorial country. Because intellectuals don't feel safe, don't have opportunities, can't live a dignified life, and so the result is absolute death. And keep in mind that it's not just a problem of Islam. It's not a coincidence that the entire intellectual field for humanity comes from the only countries in the world that invest in education and that have a relatively higher degree of freedom, which is basically Western countries. So it's not that we are finding, for instance, that great intellectuals are emerging from Russia or from China or from Mexico or from Venezuela. In fact, I mean, and this is what and some would argue that in fact the West plays an active role in trying to engineer a world in which the gravitational pull of thought is only coming from the European world and the United States and Canada and Australia and so on. But in my view, it is, you do have some serious intellectual thinkers that come out for instance, Japan and North Korea and Israel and India. I mean, at least for Hindu nationalists. India for Hindu nationalists, at least. And again, it's the same dynamics. It's because you find that a greater investment in intellectual endeavors and greater safety for people, at least within their cultural parameters. The other thing I raised by the questions and I want to comment on quickly is that this whole idea of Islamification of thought or Islamizing the humanities, you can Islamize if you can make a convincing case in the market of ideas that your Islamization project offers something new. But you cannot lower the standards and basically say, as we have here in the United States, something called the Islamic Institute for Thought, and they're constantly talking about Islamizing knowledge. And and I've given them I've listened to them very attentively and very carefully. The problem is that they only talk to each other, and they only talk to those that agree with them, and they keep the standard for intellectual engagement very low. So they don't. Their intellectuals are not people coming from top institutions with top qualifications, but they often come from the lowest of the rung, the lowest level. And then they talk about Islamizing the humanities with a lot of ambiguity and without analytical engagement. Because again, Muslims don't engage with each other. They just want to say something and be praised. And as a result, it's been decades now, and I still don't understand, and I don't think I'm alone. What does Islamizing the humanities? I mean, I can understand that you can create a constitutional system informed by Islamic values. I understand you can create a philosophy of virtue informed by Islamic values. But I don't quite understand what Islamic sociology would be, or Islamic anthropology would be. Would it pass rational analytical standards That's a question. If I engage it in the realm of logic, um, and there is a huge difference between those who believe that Islam came to limit the evils of human reason and those who believe that Islam came to bolster human reason and to support human reason and to make the human reason the source of light. Because in the first, there are those who are threatened by reason because they see reason as an instrument of the devil, and those who see reason as the instrument of God. And there is a huge ideological and philosophical difference between the two. And unfortunately, what continues to prevail in the light of the dictatorial systems that govern the Muslim world is support for those who see reason as the instrument of the devil. And it's natural that these are the people that would find support because they are the ones who usually celebrate despotism. And they find that despotism is safe and serves their own interests. Until that changes. And it must change by the bravery of Muslim intellectuals who celebrate reason as an instrument of divinity, by the bravery of these Muslim intellectuals continuing to protest the injustice of the current condition. I hope this helps, and I will stop here.